As the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals weighs whether to allow National Guard troops to deploy in Portland while a lower court lawsuit plays out in Oregon District Court, attorneys for the Oregon Department of Justice are saying the appeals court judges need to look at what's happening in the other major city where a similar lawsuit is underway, along with local ICE protests. That's Chicago. But there could be major changes on the ground in Portland if the Supreme Court decides to allow troops to deploy into Chicago. On Thursday, the 7th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, hearing the case involving National Guard deployment in Chicago, decided that federal troops can remain mobilized but cannot deploy in the Windy City for now. Right after that decision was issued, officials with the Oregon Attorney General's office issued a new filing in the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals where the case involving the National Guard deploying to Oregon is being heard. In the filing, the state of Oregon said the Ninth Circuit should look at what was said in the 7th Circuit Court decision in regards to the protests over immigration enforcement in Chicago. In short, those judges said the ICE protests in Chicago have not met the threshold to be considered a, quote, rebellion against the United States. The 7th Circuit Court decision said that a protest doesn't become a rebellion because of, quote, sporadic and isolated incidents of unlawful activity or even violence committed by rogue participants. Now, the issue at hand in both Portland and Chicago is whether the protests seen meet the threshold for a rebellion, allowing the president to deploy the National Guard to protect federal property and personnel. Now, we could get an appeals court ruling any day now that could determine whether troops can deploy to Portland, but that decision by the appellate court will be impacted if the Supreme Court decides to hear the case on National Guard deployment to Chicago.
Boy. So we got to talk about another major W for President Trump, at least for right now, as the U.S. Appeals Court is allowing President Trump to send the National Guard to Portland. Now, this is happening at the same time where you have the courts in Illinois trying to stop President Trump from deploying the National Guard in Chicago. So these two cases are similar in the sense that President Trump is trying to deploy the National Guard because you have ANTIFA terrorists and far-left extremists. They're currently committing acts of domestic terrorism against ICE, okay? And in order to protect ICE, in order to protect federal facilities, you need the National Guard because Democrat governors and Democrat mayors are refusing to do their damn jobs, right, when it comes to enforcing the law. And this is especially true in Portland, where we've seen imagery and videos of these far-left domestic terrorists attacking ICE, okay? And President Trump says enough is enough. We're clamping down on Antifa. We're sitting in the National Guard. And, of course, Democrats are relying on the woke judiciary, right, woke judges, in order to stop President Trump. But when it comes to the National Guard being deployed to Portland, it seems as if the appeals court is going to allow President Trump to do so. And I'm honestly not surprised by this because this is the same thing that happened out in California, because all it takes is for the federal government to show that, hey, you know, these rioters, right, they're actually attacking ICE agents, and therefore the National Guard is needed for protection. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into MSDNC, BS Now, boohoo whining and crying about this decision. So without further ado, let's get into it.
It was going to happen today, and it did happen today. Breaking news out of Portland. The Ninth Circuit, breaking news about Portland, I should say. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has overturned Judge Immergut's order blocking the federalization of the National Guard, which means President Trump can deploy the National Guard into Portland, Oregon. That is a big, big, big deal. Lisa Rubin, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, with us. Am I right? Big, big, big deal?
It is a big deal, and I want to just correct one thing and then explain why functionally it is the same. This is a stay of Judge Immergut's opinion, and that's why it reached the Ninth Circuit as soon as it did, because this is an emergency motion to essentially pause her order. But as a functional matter, you are absolutely correct. It has the function of overturning her order and thereby allowing the president to send the National Guard back onto the streets of Portland. And Katie, I want to read, if I can, just from a little bit of the beginning of this 93-page opinion. It says, after considering the record, and by the record they mean all the factual evidence at this preliminary stage, we conclude that it is likely that the president lawfully exercised his statutory authority under 10 U.S.C. Section 12406. That's the statute we've been referring to as Title 10 when we have conversations about the National Guard deployments, which authorizes the federalization of the National Guard when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. And this is the important part. The evidence the president relied on reflects, quote, a colorable assessment of the facts and law within a range of honest judgment. We thus conclude that defendants are likely to succeed on the merits of their appeal, basically saying that when and if a court considers all of the record in this matter is tried and it gets back to an appellate court through an ordinary process where they have full briefing and full evidence, that they still think Donald Trump is likely to prevail there because he has the discretion to determine as the president within a range of honest judgment when it is reasonable to deploy the guard.
You and I were talking about.
Yeah, so basically what she's saying in a nutshell is that the courts have basically said that, well, the president, based off his own discretion, right, he can deploy the National Guard to help protect federal agents, right, and to enforce the law, okay? Now, again, I'm not surprised by this because, again, this was already settled with California, right? All it took was for these left-wing extremists to start attacking ICE, okay? And we have this on video of them attacking ICE. And that in and of itself is enough because, again, just based off the law and how it's written, it is up to the president's discretion. And the video evidence that we have, the evidence that they showed the court, suggests that, yeah, you know, again, the president can have a reasonable interpretation that, you know, this needs the National Guard, right? Like, they can't actually carry out their duties to enforce the law without the National Guard being there. Now, MSNBC might not believe that. CNN might not believe that. The liberal media might not believe that. The Democrats might not believe that. But that doesn't matter, right? Only thing that matters is if the president believes that and if he can provide evidence showing that he has a reasonable belief, he reasonably believes that, hey, we can't execute the laws of this country without having a National Guard. And again, all you really need, again, is the video evidence, which we have plenty of, showing these domestic terrorists attacking ICE agents, right? And that they can't do their job because, again, these people are straight up blocking ICE from leaving the facility. Local law enforcement in Portland, they refuse to show up, okay? They refuse to do anything about it. So, hey, this is the situation they're in. And again, I said this before the president decided to deploy the National Guard to these liberal cities. I said, yeah, they're going to fall into a trap. Okay, you're going to have these left-wing extremists. They're going to come out and they're going to be attacking ICE. And all that they need, all the Trump administration needs, is just video evidence, video proof of that happening. And it will be legally justified to send in a National Guard, right? And lo and behold, boom, we have the appeals court basically saying the same thing. Okay, what they're basically saying is that, hey, if this goes to the Supreme Court, it is likely that the Supreme Court is going to side with the president. So therefore, we're issuing a stay on the previous judge's order.
About last week, when you get into the slippery slope of discretion, when you start ruling when a president can do something that he has the power to do, then you start potentially handcuffing a president of the United States. And this Supreme Court has shown that they don't want any handcuffs whatsoever, even if it's a questionable assertion, even if it's an egregious assertion. They want to make sure the executive is a muscular executive.
Yeah, see, again, apparently this woman doesn't understand the definition of discretion, right? It is up to the president's discretion. Now, again, he can't just do it on a whim saying, hey, you know, I believe we can't enforce federal law in Oregon, so therefore we got to bring in a National Guard. No, he can't just do it on a whim. Again, he has to have actual evidence to back it up, right? He presented the evidence, and the court sided with the president saying, yeah, like there's a reasonable conclusion to be had here that, you know, federal agents can't enforce the law, right? They can't do their job. So therefore, again, that's why it's up to the president. That's why it's at his discretion in regards to what he wants to do.
And, you know, as I did when you and I talked about this privately, I'll let the viewers in on our behind the scenes.
Please do.
I said to you that, you know, I do see the Supreme Court pushing back, for example, on the first invocation of the Alien Enemies Act, where they essentially said, we have the authority to decide what the law is with deference to the president with respect to his Article 2 powers under the Constitution, particularly in the area of foreign affairs, where the president's powers are at their most robust. Will this Supreme Court, though, cabin the president's authority to decide when something is a rebellion or when regular forces are unable to execute on the laws? You now have what lawyers call a circuit split. We have the Ninth Circuit saying Judge Immergut's order must be stayed. Conversely, we've got the Seventh Circuit saying that the court in Chicago was right to prevent the deployment.
So when should we expect the Supreme Court to weigh in on this?
I think we could expect the Supreme Court to weigh in as soon as this evening, and that's because Chicago owes its response to the Supreme Court by 5 p.m. tonight on Trump's emergency motion to pause what that Seventh Circuit Court has decided, because without a Supreme Court say-so, he can't send the guard into the streets of Chicago.
Yeah,
right now,
we'll see. We'll see. It's also so unusual and so frothy because this is just not something we would see another president even try to do.
Correct.
I mean, this is like it's an area of the law where you didn't think you needed to be so black and white on it, because who would do that was the initial assumption. It's just crazy thinking, crazy
Correct.
talk.
And even before this presidency, we didn't question the idea that a temporary restraining order couldn't be appealed. So just think about that for a second. These are orders that come from lower courts as temporary restraining orders. The prevailing wisdom used to be that those orders weren't even appealable because they were temporary. Now you have two courts saying, essentially, we have the authority to review them because they have the same force as a preliminary injunction. That means they can get through a layer of review that used to be impenetrable for them. It used to be like, you have a TRO, you wipe your hands, you're done.
Yeah, it turns out that, not being super specific has its benefits and has its pitfalls in terms of the Constitution and the exact intention behind it.
Yeah, see, now you heard that. Okay, another W for President Trump, at least temporarily. We're going to see what the Supreme Court ultimately says if they weigh in today, right, this evening, when it comes to Chicago, right? My gut feeling is that they're going to side with the president, and then MSNBC, they'll be really upset. Again, I think it's pretty clear, right, in regards to the president and his ability to do this. I said this from the beginning of all this. I said, well, yeah, I mean, if they get footage, if they get actual evidence of these domestic extremists attacking ICE, not letting ICE do their jobs, blocking ICE, obstructing ICE, yeah, that's all they need to bring in the National Guard. Again, we saw how this played out in California, right? I don't understand why these people are so surprised that it's playing out any differently, because we've seen the violence and the chaos in Chicago. We've seen the violence and the chaos in Portland. And because of that, yes, the president is allowed to bring in a National Guard because ICE cannot do their jobs. They can't do their jobs. So therefore, yeah, the president can bring in the National Guard. It is what it is, right? These people can boo-hoo, whine, and cry all they want. They can be upset. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the law is the law. And I think that the president is well within his constitutional authority to do what he's doing. And MSNBC Democrats, they're going to boo-hoo, whine, and cry about it. But ultimately, what they should be boo-hoo, whine, and cry about is the fact that their extremists, the left-wing extremists, were so violent that they gave the president the evidence that he needed in order to win in court in the first place. So, the Manoj Got Steak. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. Most importantly, share a Black conservative perspective. Peace.